Hello and welcome to More to the Story with Molly White. I am so glad you joined me again today. And listen, I just want to encourage you to invite everyone that you know on your social media sites, your email list, everyone you know to listen to this program today because you're going to be thoroughly educated on the abortion drug. And we've had people on the show before, and some of our guests are returning today to talk about it. But we're going to be talking about the history of it, the lack of research, how it became legal in the United States, and we're really going to give you information that you probably don't know and you need to know. And everyone that you know needs to know. So please share this link, encourage others to tune in and listen as well. Before I introduce my awesome co host and my wonderful guest today, I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Stephen Hotze with the Hotze Health and Wellness Center. He is our sponsor, and we are very grateful for his sponsorship of this podcast because we just couldn't make it happen without him. And if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or even donating to it so that we can, get a studio and do this thing as professionally as possible, we would love to hear from you. And all you got to do is contact us through our website at moretothestory.org, I believe, .com. My producer will put it up on the screen. So anyway, let me introduce my wonderful co-host. I couldn't do this show without her. She balances me out. She has a brilliant legal mind and way above me. So she really brings life to this podcast. So Mary, come on in and say hello to everyone.
Hello, Molly. I don't know about all that, but it's good to be part of the show today. I'm thankful to be here. I do want to mention, as we usually do, that if anyone has an emotional response to what you hear today, if you have abortion in your past, or if you've been touched by abortion in any way, and you find yourself with a response, there is a helpline number. We encourage you to get help. Call the H3 helpline, 866-721-7881. Or log on to operationoutcry.org, and there will be healing resources available for you there. Thank you, Molly.
Thank you. And yes, and if you're even contemplating about taking this abortion drug, stop, don't do it. Listen to this show first. And there's help and hope for you. And if you've taken this drug, this is going to be stuff that you didn't know about, and you might want to talk to an attorney afterwards. But we'll have some great attorneys on here. But so let's introduce our wonderful guest today. We have Dr. Donna Harrison, who was the director of the American Association of Pro-Life OB-GYNs. And we have Chris Gasick, who is with the Family Research Council. And we have Julie Blake, who's with the Alliance for Defending Freedom. So we would like to introduce y'all, and please come in on the show.
Thanks so much, Molly. I'll do a quick introduction. I'm Dr. Donna Harrison. I'm an OB-GYN. I have been the previous executive director of American Association of Pro-Life OB-GYNs, and I'm currently the director of research for APLOG. I'm also the chair of the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine.
Awesome. And how about you, Chris?
My name is Chris Gasick. I'm a senior fellow at the Family Research Council. I'm a lawyer. I've done other things, but I started on my own time about 23 years ago. I met Donna Harrison through some pro-life contacts and started working on, reviewing the approval of the abortion drug. We got a hold of some about 12,000 pages of FOIA documents that Concerned Women for America had generated. At least this is how I got involved in it, not how Donna got involved in it. She was involved in this years before. And I just want to say about Donna, if there's sort of like a Mount Rushmore of the pro-life medical establishment, of the great doctors in the history of the pro-life movement, she's on it. And I think she's Washington, but maybe somebody else could say that there's some other ordering, but it would be hard to find. It would be impossible to say that she isn't on the Mount Rushmore of the great pro-life doctors in the history of the United States. and that means in the history of the world. So,
Awesome. I agree with you, Chris. I
Yeah.
really do. And before we go on, and we're going to talk more about what you've talked about this research, I want to introduce Julie Blake. And Julie, would you say hello and just give us a little intro?
Hi, I'm Julie Marie Blake. I'm a lawyer with Alliance Defending Freedom, and we represented the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine and APLOG and other groups challenging the abortion drug.
Amen. And we did a program, we did a podcast on this lawsuit way back, was it in March, I believe? And so we did do a podcast on that, which I don't know if we'll touch on today. But what we want to talk about today is, and I remember this back in the 90s, I remember hearing it on the news. I remember it being talked about in some pro life circles. But we want to talk about the history of the abortion drug. Where did it come from? And then how did it get here to the United States? And Dr. Donna and Chris, if y'all wouldn't mind just kind of, working together on that.
sure. Let me just say something about the regulatory side of it. So the drug in the United States, and I'm not going to talk about any of the medical side. Donna knows all this, and she was involved in this before. But I'll just sort of give you a kind of a framing of this, right? So the mifepristone and another drug, misoprostol, were approved as part of our drug regimen on September 28th, 2000, right? So it was about 3 months before the George W. Bush administration started. So this was basically this. There was a kind of the second day that Bill Clinton was in office, they issued an executive order that essentially started depending on your age or what you think about a lot, either the Operation Warp Speed or the Manhattan Project of chemical abortion in the United States, in the history of the United States, and getting it to market in the United States because it had been approved in Europe. So it was this overriding goal of one of the most important goals of the Clinton administration to get an abortion drug regimen approved in the United States before he left office. And so it took about 93 months, 12 times 8 years, whatever, let's say, 92 months, something like that. They got it done, but they bent every rule, they twisted every arm, they did everything that they had to do to get this thing approved, and they barely got it done. And so I just wanted to say one thing about this. So if just an overview of the safety of this thing, and I think this kind of frames what, so according to the FDA's own label, this is currently, even with an in-person dispensing requirement in place, which is not true anymore, approximately 1 in 25 women, so that's now about 20,000 to 25,000, visit the ER due to complications from mifepristone abortions after they take it, right? So that's in a year that would happen. Let's say 25,000. So the FDA approved this drug that they consider this drug to be safe and effective. It sends 1 in 25 women to the hospital, to the ER. So that's just the framing I wanted to give. Now, Donna can go back and talk about all the great history. But anyway.
Thank you, Chris. And yes, Donna, let's go back a little bit to where did this dangerous drug originate, and how did it get to the United States?
Well, this drug was discovered in France, and it was discovered first as a drug. It was experimented on as a drug to treat something called Cushing's syndrome. But in the course of experimenting, they found out that it would block the pregnancy hormone progesterone. And they discovered that by blocking the pregnancy hormone progesterone, they could cause abortions. And this was a drug that was, like I said, developed in France. And the manufacturer who developed it in France was not going to bring it to the United States because of concerns that they would face lawsuits. So they didn't want the financial pressure of having to face the tort system in the United States. And so they weren't going to bring it. And that's, as Chris mentioned, it took a president sending a letter to the drug company saying, you will bring this to the United States. Crazy. And of course, something that I didn't realize until I got involved with in, investigating this drug, is that the FDA, which should be a objective, scientific body whose primary aim should be the safety of American people, but instead, it turns out that the FDA is an administrative agency that is at the behest of the president. And so when President Clinton said, "You will approve this drug," that was their mandate from the person that they were answerable to. So I think it actually corrupted the scientific process that should have underlined the FDA, but it didn't. I mean, normally, and Chris can mention this too, normally to get a drug approved, especially under the regulations that they use to get the drug approved, normally you have to have two blinded, randomized controlled trials. And this drug had one trial, was not blinded, it was not randomized, and it was not controlled. So only one, and then they used drug manufacturer data, which is not the same as a randomized controlled trial. So they bent that rule that should have, that was designed to minimize bias, but they bent that rule and allowed for the approval on a study that was not a randomized controlled trial. And that's only the beginning. So,
Wow. Wow.
yeah.
And that is so alarming, and it's so discouraging and really offensive, that because of an agenda of a sitting president, that they would completely overlook the health and safety and well-being of people who are taking these drugs in order to get it on the market. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, you're hearing it correctly. And the other just incredible thing is that the drug doesn't treat any disease. Pregnancy is not a disease.
Not a
And
disease.
the FDA approved it under something called Subpart H. Subpart H was designed for drugs that treat life-threatening infections to get them
Wow.
quickly on the market. Okay?
Wow.
And Mifeprex doesn't treat any life-threatening infection. In fact, what it does is it takes a life. So they completely bent the definition of Subpart H, and they completely bent the definition of healthcare, because abortion's not healthcare. It doesn't treat any disease, it kills a human being. So there's another way that they fundamentally distorted the purpose of the FDA to approve this drug.
And
And
normally, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, Dr. Donna, it was because they brought that drug, that abortion drug, onto the market in the United States. That's what just really caused me to have major distrust of not only the pharmaceutical industry, but of the medical industry. Because if you can legalize a drug that is not only kills a human being, but harms the mother and act like it's nothing, like it's candy, then how can I trust a pharmaceutical industry? How can I trust them?
Well,
Well,
what's
just
interesting,
oh, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
so what I was going to say is the normal process is that a drug company, comes to the FDA and says, we've got a drug, we want to do this, right? We want to get this drug approved, and then they have these negotiations, and as we've seen, as time has gone by with the vaccines and everything, it's I don't know, I think the process is very corrupted. But anyway, this was the reverse of this, right? The government decided it wanted a drug approved, right? And then it was going to do whatever it needed to do, and sort of annihilate any opposition, and coerce anyone it had to get the drug approved. So one of the things that's interesting about the regulatory process is that the drug company that makes or distributes the mifepristone, the abortion drug, is a one-trick pony. It doesn't really do anything else. And so it's not what you would call a repeat player at the FDA. So the FDA has all kinds of leverage over the real drug companies, right? So, if they use it all the time. So if you have a drug in the pipeline or it's coming down the road, and they don't like the way you're behaving with them on a drug that they're currently regulating and they want you to do it, they'll punish your future drugs or your future activities because of something that's going on, right? So they have a lot of leverage and they use it this way. So the real drug companies that had this drug in France also had other drugs and other interests here in the United States. It was eventually bought by a German company, and it was the German company that handed over the patent to an international population control group called the Population Council. It was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, the whole thing is so kind of crazy, but and then the Population Council out of New York stood up this, just completely crazy, incompetent, they basically, just opened up a shingle and created a drug company. And then from 0 to 60, they had to get this drug approved. And, real drug companies have huge infrastructures to get drugs approved, right?
Wow.
So it was the whole process. When you go back and look at it, it's hard to believe, what happened. And I had to sort of do a lot of this when when the case came to the Supreme Court and, the Texas case, and start thinking about it again. But anyway, back to you, Donna.
Oh, so just to say, we can't paint the pharmaceutical and the medical industry with too broad a brush. This isn't everybody. This is Danco. This is the Population Council, who's definitely interested in decreasing the population, and this is a very prejudiced administrative command to approve a drug to FDA, which is an administrative, branch of the government. So it's not like every drug is corrupted, but this particular drug approval process was very corrupt.
Well, it is corrupt, but the thing for me is it kills and it harms. It doesn't save and heal. It kills and it harms. And this is what I want our viewers and our listeners to understand. This drug was never researched properly. And what Dr. Donna Harrison is saying and Chris Kasich is that everything about the approval of this drug was not based on the normal ways that drugs are approved in the United States. Am I saying that, summing it up correctly?
Yes.
That's right.
And just to take that one step further, can we put a pin in it to say, ordinarily the driving force behind this would be a medical condition that would then trigger the pharmaceutical companies to be doing research and creating drugs to solve a medical condition that was a disease or a problem. And that is exactly what wasn't happening here. There was no precipitating factor that was creating a demand within the market. This was a top down. So is that the difference? Is that correct?
That's part of the difference. And see, like the other drugs approved under Subpart H, I think one is a drug for treatment of leprosy, serious and life-threatening diseases. One was a drug for treatment of sepsis. I mean, there's only been a handful of drugs that have been approved under this particular Subpart H, and they're all for life-threatening conditions. Pregnancy is not a life-threatening condition. It's a normal physiological process. And so this actually turns the whole idea of medicine on its head, because medicine, as Molly so well said, is supposed to heal and to help, not to kill human beings and to harm others. So this is directly opposite of the purpose of medicine.
And there's one other kind of weird irregularity about this is that there's a second drug involved, right? So there's mifepristone and then there's misoprostol. And so misoprostol is also, I think it's Cytotec, right, Donna?
Right, that's right.
Yeah. So it was a drug that was created to, I guess for people who were taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories to help prevent stomach, ulcers and things like this. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the point is, right, the company was Searle, and they weren't even involved in this process at all. They wanted nothing to do with it. Their product was just coercively ensconced into disapproval, right? And there was just, this is going to be part of our, part of our drug regimen for this because it had a function that, related to a condition that pregnant women are in and uterine contractions and this kind of stuff, and something that needed to be done to make the mifepristone and only abortions become effective, right? In other words, killing more babies, right? So it had to be kind of welded into the structure. And I think this is part of the whole issue that I have, at least in retrospect. I mean, we always had this problem going forward. But at the time, or now, I kind of realize what FDA really sort of created wasn't even so much, it created this drug regimen, obviously, but it created an entire distribution network and a regime. And so in our amicus brief in the case, I just sort of mentioned this. We identified the doctors like Donna and the other doctors as the downstream patsies in this system of, and we can talk about this in, if we ever do a second part here. In other words, when you approve this, then you're sending 1 in 25 women to the emergency rooms, and FDA knows this, right? What kind of a safety system are you going to put in place for this drug to be allowed on the market? It would seem like what you would do is you would have a very tightly controlled, regulated oversight model. But what we have gotten is a totally laissez-faire, open regulatory system that just puts people, who are injured, right, who have taken the drug, out into the system to go essentially be dumped into ERs, into emergency rooms. That's the system that FDA created. And so when you're downstream of this, you're a doctor, who you have no idea what's coming at you. And but the FDA was very cynical in doing this. And as to paraphrase, something that I think it's kind of a statement about regulatory policy in general. What they did was they privatized the upside of the approval, of all the benefits of it, to the drug company and to the political benefits to the abortion industry. But they socialized the costs, right? In other words, they spread the costs all across society and all of the people who sort of had to interact with this. And I think this is an area where the states themselves may have more to say about this in the upcoming litigation, but we're not going to go into that. But I think as I think about it more, state legislatures need to think about, well, who is paying for the follow-up ER visits? Is the government, is the state of Texas paying for it, or Kansas, or, those kinds of things. But anyway, I don't want to go too far afield, but that's what they created. They created more than just an approval. And Donna was aware of this at the time.
I have a question.
I want to go over something Chris started with, because I think it's really important to understand. Normally, for a drug to be approved for an indication, the manufacturer of the drug has to go to the FDA and say, FDA, please approve this. These are the studies we've done for effectiveness and safety. Okay. So Danco, Planned Parenthood Population Council, it was actually Population Council that filed the new drug approval request. They had that single study of mifepristone, but the only way that it could be approved would be in combination with another drug that was somebody else's drug.
Wow.
Misoprostol is not Population Council's drug. Misoprostol was, as Chris said, it was Seal's drug. And Seal never asked the FDA to approve it for this indication. So the FDA simply took Seal's drug, patched it onto Mifeprex, and said, oh, we're approving them both. But you can't do that. It's not FDA's property. So,
Wow.
so they completely violated their own rules about how a drug approval process works. I just wanted to point that out because Chris brought it up, and it's really important. The manufacturers at Cytotec did not ask for their drug to be used in abortion.
Wow.
Another way where the protocol was not just not followed, it was really bent in the opposite direction in a sense.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And
One of the
probably the
things-
only time it ever bent the rules was for this drug. They don't do it for any other drug, correct?
I can't answer about any other drug, but I can answer about this drug, and they bent it.
Well, you would probably hear about it if it did happen, but go ahead, Mary. I'm sorry.
Well, I do know that Dr. Harrison and Chris and others were involved in conducting research and not just speaking generally about the research you all were involved in, and this was before approval and after. So is that unusual that there would be private actors, so to speak, testing and doing their own research because of the concern, seeing what FDA might do, trying to point out the truth of what the drug actually does?
Boy, Mary, you bring up something that's so interesting. So FDA, in doing this approval under Subpart H, they did require the manufacturer to do certain studies to look at teenage population because they approved the drug in teens, and they waived a rule that required drug testing in teenagers before you approve a drug in the teenage population. They just waived the rule for no reason. They just said we waive it, and they didn't give any explanation. So the FDA did ask that some studies called post-marketing studies be done, and none of them were ever done. And the FDA did nothing about it. Okay, so the manufacturer didn't have to comply with any of the studies. They wanted studies on what happens to babies that have been exposed to this drug, and yet the baby isn't killed and the pregnancy goes on. What happens to those babies, and what happens to women who aren't close to an ER? See, this is the other thing that just was so maddening. All of the studies for safety, they all required women to have an ultrasound to know exactly how far along they were, to be within an hour or so of the ER. This is the unblinded, non-randomized trial that the FDA approval rested on. The patients all had an ultrasound. They all were within an hour of an ER if they had complications. They had some other restrictions. None of that was mirrored in the approval process. They didn't require an ultrasound. They didn't require patients to be close by. They did, fortunately, require that the woman be given the drug in person. Why is that important? Okay, now let's think about this. You've got a drug, a powerful abortion drug, and you hand it to somebody. Who knows who's going to get that drug? I mean, it may be a rival. It may be, someone maybe the woman's a pimp or she's
Yeah, she has a
managing a
pimp.
drug.
Mhm.
Okay, or she has a pimp. Okay, who knows who's getting that drug? So the reason for the in-person dispensing was so that you know that the person who was diagnosed as pregnant at a certain point is actually the one getting the drug. And then there was a second visit that was required before they got the second drug, Cytotec or misoprostol. The second visit was required because 5% of women, 1 out of 20, will pass the baby just with the Mifeprex alone, just with the first drug. And so she doesn't need the second drug. So the doctor or whoever it was that was giving the drug was supposed to check and see if maybe she doesn't even need the second drug. And then she was supposed to have a third visit to make sure all the tissue had passed. Why? Because if you have retained tissue left in your womb after you pass part of the tissue, that dead tissue gets infected and you can die. And we've even seen recent deaths from women who have taken the Mifeprex drug regimen. They've died from overwhelming infection. And that's the reason for the 3 visits. And now FDA says,
You
send
don't
it
need
through
those.
the mail.
Yeah,
You don't
need those.
need it.
Yeah.
I mean, I could go on about this. In fact, if you don't mind, I am going to go on about this a little bit.
Well, we've got just a couple minutes remaining, but we do want to go on, and we do want our listeners and viewers to know we're going to do a part 2 because there's just too much information to share in a 30-minute broadcast. But go ahead, Dr. Harrison, and finish up, and then we're going to invite y'all to stay on, and we're going to do a part 2.
Okay, in the part 2, I'm going to talk about ectopic pregnancies. That is when the pregnancy is actually outside the uterus and not inside. Mifeprex doesn't treat it. I'm going to talk about Rhogam, which is a medicine we give to women who are Rh negative, that is B negative or A negative or O negative blood. They have to have Rhogam, and we're going to talk about that and how it's not happening with abortions. And then we're going to talk about how the risks increase as the pregnancy increases. And I'll save all that till the next one.
Well, thank you, Dr. Donna Harrison and Chris and Julie for coming on. And we're going to end this show, but just stay tuned because we're going to do part 2, and you're not going to want to miss this information. It's been incredible. You know, there's power in information, and we want y'all to be fully informed before you make a choice, or so that you can educate others. So thank y'all for being on. Mary, thank you. And we are going to tune out, and we will see you again on part 2. Thanks for listening to More to the Story with Molly White. See you next